Hi, Amble.
Hi.
Can you just shortly introduce your piece called We Ask Those Questions to Everybody?
So the piece is a digital opera, and it has two sections which weave in and out of each other. And one section is built on a verbatim interview of a disabled woman going to be interviewed to see if she can get disability support from the government. And it's the real text from a real interview. And the other part are interviews with disabled people that look at lots of different aspects of disabled life. So society, friendships, productivity, philosophy, death. And we weave those two aspects together. So the disability interview is very kind of narrow. It's like, can you lift a box? How, can you make a piece of toast? It's these tiny little questions. And then the chorus parts are like these huge, expansive conversations about lots of aspects of disabled life. And then it goes between those two, and the character who is being interviewed finds support from the disabled community who are kind of feeding in, and those are real life samples from interviews that I did with disabled people, so they're real voices, and
Yes.
that's the base.
And musicians?
The musicians are it's completely disabled cast and crew. So there's me doing the electronics. There is Steph West, who is a harp player who's disabled. Um, uh, she has limb difference, so one of her hands doesn't work in
Mm.
the same way that hands do, and she also has a fatigue condition. Victoria Orowari is the singer who plays Lynn, who's the interviewer, and she's blind. We worked with Sonia Alori, who has multiple impairments, and one of her impairments is hearing loss. She's also had multiple strokes. She's a wheelchair user, has fatigue conditions and mobility issues. And we worked with Clarence Adu, who is paraplegic. So he has movement in one shoulder and in his head, and he controls his computer using a tube that he puts in his mouth, and he can move the tube around with his tongue, and that controls his mouse cursor. And when he blows into the tube, that's a click. And so for that, I built him a specific Max MSP based sampler, and we put all the samples of the interviews into the sampler, and then he could control the mix of the voices coming out by clicking on certain numbers, and playing the sampler in that way, layering up different samples, triggering them in different orders. And he could also choose the volume of the samples and how often they repeated and looped over the top of each other. So those were the instrumentalists, and Steph, the harp player, also sings the part of Hannah, who is the disabled person being interviewed, and she plays the harp in the choruses, so she's in both sections. Sonia plays clarinet, and she's in the chorus sections. Clarence is on the sampler in the chorus sections, and Victoria and Steph are the interviewers and the interviewee,
And what are
and
the
they sing.
main, I don't know, main barriers or you need to overcome, right, to do the piece?
Yeah, so it was quite complicated in that, because I have a severe fatigue-based condition, we knew I couldn't be in a rehearsal room for like 8 hours. So the first thing was to think, well, how can we rehearse this with somebody who has to stay at home? So we decided we were going to rehearse it over the internet, and this was just before COVID. So at the time, it was like nobody rehearses via Zoom. This is crazy, but we're going to try and make an opera over Zoom. And then obviously the pandemic hit just as we were start to rehearse, so it became normal for everybody. So that was like our first barrier. And then because of the pandemic, what we'd planned to do was rehearse via Zoom, but then all get together for the recording. But obviously we couldn't do that. So we had to send everybody the recording kit. So they all had to learn how to use Ableton, they all or Audacity. We had to send them Focusrite Scarletts, microphones, cables, and teach them how to set everything up themselves so that they could record themselves. That's not specific to disability because of the pandemic. But if it hadn't been for the pandemic, that would have been a specific disability thing, which I think is quite interesting in itself, because the pandemic just sort of shifted the window of what's normal and put a lot of sort of inverted commas normal people into a disabled state where they had to think and function like we do. So it was quite a weird experience that suddenly everybody was having to act like we were anyway. And then we had to speak to each of the individuals. And so I basically use this principle where we build any project from the individuals up. So instead of deciding how we're going to do it and then work out what we need to change for each disabled person, we don't think about how we're going to do it. We think about the people, and then we work out what we can do given what the people can do. So obviously for Clarence, we needed to build a complete piece of software that he could use, because there was no sampling software that was accessible with his head mouse. And the main barrier for that is that he doesn't have a double click function. And so anything I built for him had to have single click, because he can't double click, he can't control click because he doesn't have use of his hands. So everything has to be able to, he needs to be able to run all of his software just with a mouse movement and a single click. So that meant I had to build something that specifically had those parameters for him. In terms of working with Sonia, because she has hearing loss, we were doing improvised sections, but she couldn't really respond to what the harp was playing because she couldn't really hear it very well. So we worked with Ellen Ed Chandri. I'll check that name and email it over to you. And she is a captioner, creative captioner. And she was on the Zoom call. She would listen to what the harp was doing, and in real time, she would type it out so that Sonia could see it in words. And she would use words like harp is falling like a waterfall, sounds moody and dark, sudden slamming. And so it was very descriptive. It wasn't just C sharp, F natural. It was really descriptive of the mood that the harp was creating. And because Sonia wasn't able to hear pitches so well, for each improvisation, we decided on a set of a mode where whatever she played would fit. So she didn't have to make audio decisions about, okay, now we're in F minor or now we're in D sharp major. We had like, we are now playing in this mode, and anything you do is going to be in tune. It'll be fine. So she had a set of pitches she could use, and then she had the moods coming in via text from Ellen Ed, so that she could respond to the harp without necessarily being able to hear it. And we also did a number of takes for every recording. We did a number of takes because she is hearing impaired. Sometimes her pitching, because the clarinet, the pitch depends on your mouth pressure. And if you can't hear the pitch very clearly, you might not have the mouth pressure quite right. And so we did a number of takes so that if any of it was slightly pitchy, I could pull those samples out and replace them with something that she'd done in another take. Because obviously she didn't want something that was kind of microtonal going into the show if that wasn't kind of what she wanted. And she said she would prefer it to be edited for pitch correctness. So that's what we did with Sonia. With Steph, Steph has a lot of inbuilt coping strategies, which means she basically doesn't ask for very much. She works as a harp teacher and plays for a lot of harp weddings, so she interfaces with the non-disabled world a lot. So she's basically learned to cover up her disabled. And so when she presents for as a performer, she doesn't say, oh, I need this and this and this. She just goes, I'll be fine, which is a coping strategy that a lot of disabled people use. They kind of internalize all the adjustments that need to be done and don't ask anything of the rest of the ensemble. And so She's a folk singer, so we sent her the music to learn by ear because that's what she asked for. She said, you know, don't worry about a score. I will just learn it by ear if you send it over to me. And the heart parts, we'd worked together before, and she sort of told me, like, there are certain stretches that she can't do, certain chords that she can't do because of the way her hand is built. But because we were working with improvisation, actually that didn't make any difference because she was in charge of what she was doing. And so there was never a point where I was like, I need you to play this chord, because it was always her choice what she was playing. So she could choose anything that was comfortable for her. And then in the improvisations, we had another rule, or another sort of founding principle, which was that on any given day, however you feel, that's fine. So we weren't saying like, this is a recording day, I need you to give it 100%. It was like, yes, it's a recording day, but if you don't feel well, if you feel tired, if your hands aren't coordinating, if your ears are playing up today, just do the minimal, and we'll still make a show from it. Like, that's fine. So a lot of disabled people experience kind of fluctuating conditions. So some days we're terrible, some days we're brilliant. And as a professional musician, that's really difficult, because you need to be at like 80, 90, 100% during a performance or a rehearsal or a recording. And if your body isn't there, then there's nothing you can do to change that. And it's very difficult to say to somebody, I might not be able to play that on Thursday. I don't know. So one of the principles we had is, don't worry about being your best, just bring us what you've got. And whatever you do, even if you just lie on the floor and do nothing, I can still make a show from that. It's not a problem. Like, I will edit my way around what you give me. So it was kind of about trying to disperse the power amongst the group and say, like, you bring what you want to bring, you play what you want to play, you tell me what you need. Like, do you need somebody to translate for you? Do you need somebody to type for you? Do you need somebody to like build a bit of equipment for you? And we'll put that in place. And then you just be who you are and give us what you've got, and that's fine. And that's kind of flips the idea of a rehearsal, where it's like, here's the music, I want you to play it, you must be able to play it by Tuesday, which is like the opposite of that, basically.
Yes, they are so very much, right? Yeah, they're very different musicians with different capabilities, and with different capabilities and with different limitations. What was the process? How you organize, starting from idea to premiere? What are the main stages? How you went through?
As a composer, God, I'm trying to think back. How did I do it? I worked with a librettist and a director called Toria Banks, who's also disabled, and she went through I interviewed about 20 disabled people and asked them about everything, life in general, how society views disabled people, and we just got onto lots of crazy topics, and it was brilliant, so interesting. I recommend it. Just ask lots of questions. And then all of that text plus the text from the interview went to Toria, and she edited that into the script. And then I had to go through all the interviews and find the bits of text that she'd chosen and cut them all together. And then because we'd interviewed people over Skype and Zoom and mobile phone, I had to then audio, EQ, mix, polish up every bit of that audio. And some of them I couldn't do a good job on. It was just too bad. And make each one into a single sample, like each sentence that she'd chosen, and those sentences would be put aside for the sampler. I had to notate the entire interview, so that the interview you hear is not the full interview, which is about an hour and a half long. It's edited, but it's not edited in the sense that it changes the meaning. It's just she's cut it down to make it more punchy. So then I had to go through the audio recording of the interview and cut it all into the bits that she'd cut it to, And then I would listen to it and play it back on the keyboard, which made it into the laptop and turned it into MIDI data. So the rhythm and the pitches of the interview are then turned into the melody and the pitches for the singer, for the singers. So what else did I do then? I'm trying to remember. So I had to build the sampler for Clarence. So there was a lot of like chat with Clarence about like what he'd like to be able to do with the sampler. And I'd built him something a year before for a different project. And he'd come back saying, I'd like more control over this. I'd like more control over that. Because I think on that sampler, it was literally press 1 now. And it didn't really feel like he had much creative control. He was just triggering a sample, which is not a musical talent that, you know, because he was a professional trumpet player before his accident. He has a huge amount of musical talent and musical sensibility, and pressing a button just doesn't really cut it. So we looked at how I could adapt that sampler and give him more musical control in the piece. And I adapted that sampler for him and then loaded all the samples into it and sent that over to him. He couldn't open that on his laptop without it messing up his day-to-day software, which he really needs to, you know, manage his life. So then I loaded it onto a laptop, put remote access on that laptop and posted the whole laptop to him. And then when he had it open at his end, I could log into his laptop and edit the software remotely from my house if there were any problems. Because also, you know, when you make a piece of software for somebody, if it goes wrong, you want to be able to go, oh yeah, press this and then type this in here. And of course, with Clarence, that's a really slow process because he has to like scroll through his alphabet and find every button. And it's just incredibly hard for him to fix anything that's not working at his end. And because of the pandemic, we couldn't meet up for me to test it with him. So I had this remote access where he would be like, oh, can I have this button here? Or can I move this here? Or this volume fader isn't connected properly. And then I could get into the laptop, control it remotely from my end, resave it and reopen it. And it would work at his end again. So that's what I was doing for Clarence. And then I had to work out like a kind of musical framework for it, really. So we had like the dramatic framework, the dramatic arc. We knew which sections were going to be, you know, which are intense, which are joyful, which are going to be frightening. So we had, because Toria works as a dramaturg as well, she had written this amazing emotional journey into the piece. So then I had to work out, like musically, how do I give that to the audience? And that was mainly done through the interviews. I kept really super simple, so it just has like a harp continuum, just playing a couple of notes here and there, just to kind of root it in a pitch framework. And then when it goes into the choruses, that's where we got the kind of modal stuff with the improvisation, with the different vibes. So then when we were doing the improvisations with Steph and Sonia and Clarence, we could say, okay, this is like, you know, we'd give them like a kind of a more kind of major feel mode, a mode that has, or a mode that's a bit darker, or a mode that's a little bit gritty, or we'd add in a note to a mode to make it feel really awkward if it was a really awkward kind of session. And we would give them like verbal instructions, like, you know, this is a scary improvisation, or this is a reflective improvisation, or this is a joyful improvisation. So that by doing that, we would create the kind of shape of the piece, I suppose. So then once all of that had kind of been decided on and kind of conceptualized, we went into rehearsal period, and we did that via Zoom. And it was like exceptionally hard, because I know like everybody finds Zoom exhausting. But I think like 4 of our team had a fatigue condition. And we all were having fatigue crashes at different times. The major problem that we had was that we had a deadline coming up, and we had not really anticipated. We didn't quite have enough time, I think. On reflection, we should have given ourselves like 3 months of rehearsing and recording time, and we actually had about 3 weeks. So it was really brutal in terms of the amount of hours we had to work together, much more than we would normally do safely in terms of our energy levels. So we would do like 2 days with the singers and then 2 days with the improvisers. So for Steph and I, we were in all 4 of those rehearsals. And then for me also, at the end of that, everyone else would get 3 days off, but I would get a mountain of home recorded audio sent to me by the musicians that I would then have to make sense of. I would have to edit it, I would have to EQ it, I'd have to like put it together, choose the right takes, work out, you know, oh, we want, and talk to the director, like, well, this take has the right energy to it, that take's more pitchy. Find the takes that are going to tell the story the best, work out what they all are, put them together, save it, EQ it, try and make it beautiful. And as soon as we kind of got that scratch, we'd be back into another rehearsal and recording session with the singers on the Monday. So because the show was supposed to be live originally, we had just planned to rehearse and then do the show live. And we didn't have any flex in the budget for recording, editing, mixing, mastering. There was nothing in the time frame for that. But because of COVID, we had to fit that in between all the rehearsals and it going live on screen. And it was just ridiculous. Like, I was doing like composing, I was leading rehearsals, I was editing, I was mastering, I was EQing. I was just like utterly exhausting, brain fryingly difficult.
And how your cooperation, right, with musicians, how it shaped the piece, right?
Sorry, what was the question?
And
the audio.
how your cooperation or protest, right, with musicians shaped the piece. Is it shaped or not? Is it was the same as you intended, or they provided some kind of directly or indirectly some inputs, which was significant, and you and piece changed due to that?
Yeah, so the piece is designed that the power is given away by the composer. So like one of the principles of disabled theory that I work with is about dispersal of power. So what you would identify in disability studies in terms of barriers is that what tends to happen is one person who's at the top of a structure decides how things are going to be, and everyone else has to fit into that structure. And what we would say under disabled, under my framework of disabled studies that I use, is that actually that is what causes barriers for disabled people, because the person making the decisions doesn't anticipate what the disabled person is going to need. And even if they ask them, the design of the project is still probably not going to work for them. So what I do, both in the production of the piece and in the composing of the piece, is to give away as much power as possible and to say to the musicians, you make this yours now. I want, just bring what you can, sing it how you want to sing it. If it feels right, it is right. If you want to play it, if you want to give 100% or 20%, if you want to take it somewhere in the improvisations, I want you to bring what you want to bring to the piece. So we had talks about what we were trying to achieve with the piece. We had talks about the general mood that it flowed. A lot of my other work is a little bit more anarchist in that I don't even have that dramaturgical structure. But because this was an opera, it had to have that kind of dramaturgical linear structure. So we had a sense of where each section would go and how it would land, and what it goes into. But it's very much like once I give those samples to Clarence, he decides what order those samples are played in. Steph decides how she responds to it musically. Sonia and Eleanor decides what she writes about it. For Sonia, decide, so in that sense, it's not really my composition. it's something that I created a framework for, that then everyone else gave what they wanted to give.
Yes,
And it's so, you know.
And what you learn from this piece?
Oh, so much. I think up until that point, being a disabled composer, I had just worked on my own, because every time I tried to interface with an ensemble, I would just get battered by the structure of how to function as a classical composer. And I couldn't do it because of my health situation. I can't do rehearsals, I can't do back-to-back days, I can't do long days, I can't edit or reflect on things overnight and bring you back anything the next day for a rehearsal. I just don't, I'm just not well enough to do that. So learning to, like, doing things in this way, it was like, okay, if I was to do things in the way that I would like to do them, what would happen? So, and it was about kind of having that same question to all the disabled people, like, if you could do things the way you want to do them, what would it look like? And can we get all of those realities to interface with each other? And sometimes we totally couldn't. Sometimes somebody had to be pushed beyond where they were comfortable with. And I think a lot of the time it was me, purely because we didn't plan it properly, and that's on me. So it's not anybody else's fault. And so, but there is always a point, I think, like, we can't say that access is access and we have one way of doing things and it works and that's how you do it, because some people's needs will clash with others. Like, some people that, like, on another piece that I worked with, one of the people needed absolute clarity about what was going on, when it was going on, what it was for. And the other person needed a lot of freedom and was like, if you tell me that, I'm just going to stress out. So it's like, well, how, if I'm a director, how can I give you both what you need? I can't. And specifically, we had somebody with this need for precision and somebody with an anxiety disorder who just wanted to be able to come and go as they please. And I can't give both of those people what they need in the same rehearsal. So there's always a clash. Well, not always, but, you know, we have to be prepared for the fact that what one person needs might then be a problem for somebody else. And then there needs to be another conversation about, well, how do we resolve this without one of you feeling like you've been ignored, or one of you feeling like your needs don't matter as much? Because I think it's also, with disability, we often think of access as, can you get in the room? But there's also like an equality of experience. It's like, did you get into the room with dignity, or did you get wheeled in past the bins? You know, it's like, did you come into that room and experience the same level of respect and integrity and support as everybody else? Or did you feel like a problem? Did you feel like, you know, a piece of meat? Did you feel like a bit of cargo being put up in the cargo lift? Like, it's an equality of experience. And, like, it's incredibly hard. And I mean, I definitely didn't always succeed with this. Like, it really was a struggle. And I'm sure that other musicians would tell you that there were points where it was incredibly difficult. They were brilliant and they were so professional and they just held it and they did it. And when one of us, that's the other nice thing about having this non-hierarchical balance, is that when one of us couldn't, another one stepped in and held it for a moment. You know, it was like, I got to a point, it was like, I think the singer really needed something and I just couldn't provide it. Like, I had no capacity, but I knew that they really needed it. And at that point, Toria was like, okay, I can step in, tell me what to do. She's not a musician, but she has some musical skills. And she was like, I will start this and you can just oversee it, because I can see you can't. About that flexibility and that care that kind of,
Just a last question, like maybe in 3 words, 3 main suggestions for composers who would like to write something for musicians with special needs or with disabilities. What is
Disabled
the-
musicians.
in 3 sentences, right? 3 main things.
Okay. The first thing is start from your musicians, get to know them, ask them like, how do you prefer to work? What do I need to know about how you work, about your instrument, about like if there are any barriers. The second thing is be prepared to be flexible. So it's think about how you can provide options for that player. So if you give them a massive solo, maybe give them like an easy version, a middle version, and a difficult version. So on the day, if they're like not that, you know, they can flick between. So give people options and flexibility in the piece and empowerment. And then the third one, just keep checking in with people. Like, don't assume that you can write something and send it to them and they'll play it. It's like it has to be a dialogue. It has to be a collaboration. It has to be a group endeavor, and it's about hearing. Yeah, just keep checking in with people. Make it a dialogue.
So thank you very much for our talk.
That's